The room was small and still. The narrator said, Jonah knelt beside a candle and searched for words. Jonah Reed said, "If anyone hears me, I am tired of the dark." The air grew sharp, like metal on the tongue. The flame stretched thin and tall. Shadows slid the wrong way across the walls. Jonah covered his eyes and felt the floor tremble. A cold white fire burst and filled the room with hard light. A tall shape formed within the glare, edges bright like silver. Jonah Reed said, "Who are you?" The shape did not step, yet it felt close. A voice sounded inside his chest and marked him. The voice said, "You have been seen." Jonah shook, but he did not run. The light held him like a steady hand. The narrator said, he would learn the light would not let go. Morning came thin and gray. The narrator said, Jonah tried to call it a dream, but the word broke in his mouth. He made coffee and watched the steam curl like a sign. Jonah Reed said, "I am not broken, but I am not well." Silence filled the room like water in a glass. He saw the tall shape again in his mind, and felt both dread and pull. Jonah Reed said, "If you are real, do not leave me." The kettle clicked and the clock kept time like a small hammer. The narrator said he feared being seen, yet he longed to be known. He sat with his cup, and a shaking he could not hide. Hope and fear took turns in his chest and would not let go. The church door was open, and the hall smelled like wood and dust. The narrator said, Jonah did not plan to speak, only to sit. Pastor Miriam Cole stepped from a pew with a calm face. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "You look like you met a storm." Jonah tried to smile, but the smile failed fast. Jonah Reed said, "I met a light that did not burn." Pastor Miriam Cole said, "You are safe here. Take your time." He told her pieces, and she did not rush to fix them. The sunlight fell in soft bands across the floor. The narrator said he felt watched, yet not judged. Jonah breathed easier and stayed longer than he meant to stay. Ethan met Jonah outside the diner they used to love. The narrator said, "They once laughed here after long shifts." Ethan Ward said, "You look wrecked, talk to me." Jonah told the shape of the night, not the whole. Ethan laughed once, then stopped when he saw the eyes. Ethan Ward said, "You saw a trick. Brains do that." Cars hissed past and neon shook on wet glass. Jonah Reed said, "It spoke inside me, not from the air." Ethan Ward said, "I need proof, not a feeling." The narrator said, "Doubt drew a line that Jonah must cross or leave alone." Jonah held the door and could not step in or step away. Night returned, and the room felt aware. The narrator said, Jonah sat where the candle had burned cold. He did not light it again. He waited in the quiet and let his breath slow. The window held a thin moon, sharp as a cut. Jonah Reed said, "If you have seen me, see me now." The walls stayed still, yet the air thickened with a soft weight. He closed his eyes not to hide but to yield. The voice did not speak this time. Even so, the sense of it pressed near. The narrator said he learned that presence can be a silence with weight. Jonah breathed and did not run. A small steady glow seemed to grow within, mild and sure. The day moved like a slow cart, and Jonah felt the wheels grind. The narrator said he walked his room and counted steps he could not finish. He stared at a mirror that would not lie. Jonah Reed said, "I remember the road and the noise." Past opened like a door with a broken hinge. He saw headlights, rain, and a turn he did not make. The narrator said he saved himself and left a stranger in pain. A hush pressed on his ribs until breath hurt. Jonah Reed said, "I did not go back." The kettle hissed like a warning that came too late. He set his hands on the sink and bowed his head. The voice did not speak, but the weight stayed. The narrator said, "Truth has feet, and they stand where you stand." Jonah sat across from Pastor Miriam in a quiet office that smelled like books. The narrator said he wanted a map, not a mirror. Pastor Miriam Cole said, Light tells the truth, but it also heals. Jonah Reed said, it asks too much. She folded her hands and waited. Pastor Miriam Cole said, confession is not a show. It is a door that opens from your side. Sunlight traced the desk and warmed the old wood. The narrator said, he heard mercy and felt fear at the same time. Jonah Reed said, if I speak, I will break. Pastor Miriam Cole said, break into better shape. Silence sat with them like a third guest. The clock ticked, not in threat, but in patience. He did not answer, yet he did not leave. Ethan chose a booth near the window and waved Jonah in. The narrator said, he trusted facts the way a sailor trusts stars. Ethan Ward said, tell me the parts you skipped. Jonah spoke of the white fire and the words in his chest. Ethan Ward said, brains make noise under stress. The rain turned to mist and neon bled on the glass. Jonah Reed said, it knew my wrong before I said it. Ethan Ward said, memory fills gaps, guilt paints details. The narrator said, doubt set its tools on the table and went to work. Jonah looked at his hands and saw how they shook. Ethan Ward said, if it is real, let it face questions. Jonah did not argue. He only felt the pull grow stronger. Lila waited in a small community room with folding chairs and a cross on the wall. The narrator said she knew the road Jonah walked, stone by stone. Lila Brooks said, I was sure grace was for other people. She spoke of a night with sirens, and a choice she could not undo. Lila Brooks said, I confessed, and it did not crush me. Jonah watched her eyes hold both sorrow and light. Pastor Miriam Cole said, truth frees slow, but it frees. The room held a simple hush, like a hand on a wound. Lila Brooks said, you can step forward and still shake. The narrator said, Jonah heard the door inside him click. He did not step through yet, but the latch moved. Jonah walked fast under a low sky that held more rain. The narrator said, he tried to outpace a light that did not tire. He cut through an alley and past the place where a street once bent wrong. Jonah Reed said, I cannot undo the night, but I can face it. A hush came that felt like the start of speech. He stopped and set his palm on a brick wall, steadying his breath. Headlights slid by at the far end and faded. The narrator said, the past did not chase him. It waited in the open. Jonah Reed said, show me what to do next. He felt no words in his chest, only warmth. He turned toward the church and did not look back. Morning settled over the hallway, and the house felt unsure of itself. The narrator said, Jonah tried each door and found latches softer than they should be. The knob turned with no push, and hinges breathed like a living thing. Jonah Reed said, this is not a trick I can name. The clock in the kitchen froze on 1 hour and did not move. The sound of rain paused, then returned in a thin hush. He stood very still and waited for fear to choose him. It did not. The narrator said, signs rose like small flags on a field he once ignored. He touched the clock and felt a faint thrum under the glass. Jonah Reed said, if you want me to listen, I am listening. The air seemed to nod. He opened the last door and faced a room that knew his steps. The community room smelled like coffee and paper. The narrator said, Lila waited with a story she had not told clean through. Lila Brooks said, I hid, and it broke me in slow motion. She spoke of a night with glass, sirens, and a prayer she did not believe. Lila Brooks said, I walked into the station, and the ground still held me. Jonah watched, and the words drew heat to his face. Pastor Miriam Cole said, mercy moves into the open, not the corner. Lila Brooks said, I was forgiven, and it did not erase what I did. The narrator said, Jonah heard a door inside him unlatch again. He did not speak, but his shoulders lowered. Lila Brooks said, you can be held and still be honest. He nodded once and did not run from her eyes. The sanctuary was quiet, and the light through glass drew soft colors on the floor. The narrator said, Miriam did not hide her questions like coins in a jar. Pastor Miriam Cole said, I once failed a woman who asked for help, and it still wakes me. Jonah felt the words settle like a mantle he could share. Pastor Miriam Cole said, faith does not clear the sky, it stands under the cloud. A sparrow struck the window and flew off whole. The sound was small and complete. The narrator said, he trusted her honesty more than any answer. Pastor Miriam Cole said, bring your truth here and let it breathe. He looked toward the altar and thought of the night that marked him. Jonah Reed said, I am close to the door, but I am afraid of the hinge. Evening fell on slick streets, and Ethan crossed at the light with his mind on facts. The narrator said, he trusted signals and lines, and the proof of repeatable things. Tires hissed, and a horn cut the air. Ethan Ward said, watch it, to no one and to himself. A car slid on a sheen, and curved toward him like a bad thought. The crosswalk signal flickered and held red, though he stood in the white bars. His foot caught on a crack, then freed like a hand had lifted him. The car passed close and did not touch. Ethan Ward said, that was too near. The narrator said, doubt does not die, but it learns to blink. He looked back at the signal and found it steady. He walked on with a new, smaller voice inside. Night folded over the bathroom like a curtain. The narrator said, Jonah faced the mirror that did not pity him. He saw his outline, and then a rim of white fire traced his shoulders. Jonah Reed said, I will not run. The light held, and the rest of the room fell a step away. He thought of the road and the choice he made when fear ruled him. The narrator said, a man can meet himself and choose him new. The rim brightened and did not burn. Jonah Reed said, I will speak the whole truth. The mirror did not nod, yet the air felt pleased. He reached for the light switch and left it off. The quiet felt earned, not empty. He stood long enough to believe the choice would last. Night pressed soft against the window, and Jonah drifted between waking and sleep. The narrator said he dreamed of a hallway made of light. The floor shone like water that held his steps. The divine messenger stood at the far end and waited. Jonah Reed said, I am here. The divine messenger said, I name what you hide. The dream air rang like a quiet bell. Jonah saw rain on black asphalt and a car that did not stop. The divine messenger said, you left a hurt behind you. Jonah Reed said, I was afraid. The messenger's eyes held both calm and weight. The narrator said, truth stood before him and did not move aside. Jonah Reed said, show me the way back. The divine messenger said, begin with your voice. The light widened like a door. Morning came cold and honest. The narrator said, memory turned from fog to road. Jonah stood by the window and watched a thin line of cloud. He let the scene return without edits. Jonah Reed said, there was rain, a bend, and a shadow in the lane. The wiper smeared water and fear across glass in his mind. The narrator said, he chose flight over help and drove on. His hands shook like before, but he did not look away. Jonah Reed said, I heard a cry, but I kept going. The kitchen clock ticked and did not judge him. He pressed his palm to the cool glass and breathed. The narrator said, the past did not break him, but it bent him toward truth. Jonah Reed said, I will speak this out loud today. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and wax. The narrator said, Miriam chose a pew near the aisle and did not hide her face. Pastor Miriam Cole said, I failed a woman who asked for help. Jonah felt the words land like a stone that fit his hand. Pastor Miriam Cole said, I told myself I was busy, and she walked away alone. Sunlight broke into colored bands across the floor. The narrator said, her honesty lifted the air rather than crush it. Jonah Reed said, I left someone too. Pastor Miriam Cole said, then let us not leave each other now. The hush felt warm and near. The narrator said, shared truth made room for courage. Jonah Reed said, I will confess. Pastor Miriam Cole said, I will stand beside you. Ethan opened his laptop at the library table and set his jaw. The narrator said, he sought lines, dates, and reports that do not glow or whisper. Keys clicked like rain on a roof. Ethan Ward said, if there is truth here, I will find it. Screens loaded slowly, then filled with records. The narrator said, he found a report from a rainy night and a note about a hit and run. Ethan leaned close and read the map and the hour. Ethan Ward said, this matches what he said. The room hummed with quiet vents and sober light. He took a breath that felt new and careful. Ethan Ward said, then I must stand with him. The narrator said, doubt blinked and stepped back a pace. Night gathered in Jonah's room and leaned close. The narrator said, a voice came that sounded like his own and not his own. Doubt said, you cannot be forgiven. The air cooled a shade. Jonah Reed said, I am done with hiding. Doubt said, you will be judged and left. The floor did not tremble this time. The narrator said, fear tried old tricks and found less room. Jonah Reed said, I will speak to those I hurt, and I will tell it here. Doubt said, you are not worth the light. Jonah stood taller than he felt. The narrator said, courage is a small fire that does not go out. Jonah Reed said, I choose the light. The quiet did not applaud, yet it held. The storm rolled in early and took the lights without asking. The narrator said, the church held a low hum like a ship in rough water. Candles were set in a line and threw soft circles on the pews. Jonah Reed said, I am here. Pastor Miriam Cole said, you are not alone. Wind pressed at the doors and the roof clicked. Lila Brooks stood close and kept her hands still. The aisles felt longer than before. The narrator said, fear moved, but it did not lead. Ethan Ward opened the side door and closed it with care. Ethan Ward said, power is out across the block. Thunder rolled, then faded to a long sigh. The room calmed as if it chose to listen. Jonah Reed said, I have something to say when I can stand up to it. The candles hissed a little as drafts crossed the nave. The narrator said, a figure formed at the back where the shadows gathered. Doubt said, silence protects you. Keep it. Jonah felt the words slide under his ribs. Jonah Reed said, no. Doubt said, confession will strip you and leave you cold. Pastor Miriam Cole moved one step closer and did not speak. Lila Brooks folded a tissue in small squares. Ethan Ward set his jaw and watched the aisle. The narrator said, old fear offered the same trade it always offered. Thunder spoke once and was done. Jonah Reed said, I am not a secret. The room did not brighten, yet it felt wider. Doubt said, you will regret this. Jonah looked at the altar and did not look away. Lila stepped forward before anyone else moved. The narrator said, her voice was soft, but it carried. Lila Brooks said, you can shake and still take the step. Jonah Reed said, I do not know if I can stand up there. Lila Brooks said, walk with me. We will go slow. Pastor Miriam Cole nodded and touched the edge of the rail. The wind eased as if the storm remembered to rest. The narrator said, kindness cut a path through the fear. Ethan Ward said, I will be here when you turn around. Doubt stood very still and watched. Lila Brooks said, say what is true, and let it land. Jonah Reed said, I will try. The hush that followed felt like a door that wanted to open. Ethan took a breath he did not know he needed. The narrator said, he had said no to faith for years, but he would not say no to his friend. Ethan Ward said, I will stand here, and I will not move. Pastor Miriam Cole said, thank you. Doubt said, you are lending faith to a lie. Ethan Ward said, I saw enough to ask better questions. The candles shook once, and then steadied. Lila Brooks looked back and gave a small nod. The narrator said, loyalty found a seat beside courage. Jonah Reed said, I am ready to speak. The wind turned and carried rain away from the windows. Ethan Ward said, "Go on. I am with you." The room waited with a patience that felt like strength. Jonah stepped to the lectern and set both hands on the wood. The narrator said, "He chose to stand where he could be seen." Jonah Reed said, "I left a man in need on a wet night, and I drove on." The words sat plain and did not break him. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "Thank you for the truth." Lila Brooks wept and smiled at the same time. Ethan Ward looked down, then up, and did not look away. "Doubt," said, "they will turn from you." No one moved away. The narrator said, "Silence answered the lie." Jonah Reed said, "I will go to those I hurt and make it right." The storm thinned to a whisper. The light in the room did not grow brighter, yet it felt closer and warm. Candles burned low, and the church felt like a held breath. The narrator said, "A dark weight gathered near the chancel rail." Doubt stepped from the shadow as if it owned the aisle. "Doubt," said, "you spoke, and now you will be left." Jonah Reed said, "I will not run." The air cooled a little, but fear did not lead him. The divine messenger stood near the lectern and did not move. The divine messenger said, "Stand in the light you chose." Thunder rolled far off, like a memory finishing its line. Pastor Miriam Cole set a hand on the rail and prayed without sound. Lila Brooks watched with wet eyes and steady breath. Ethan Ward stood firm, unsure of answers, sure of where to stand. Doubt spread like smoke and tried to thin the candlelight. The narrator said, "It spoke with Jonah's tone and promised safety for a price." Doubt said, "Hide again, and the world will forget." Jonah Reed said, "I am done hiding." The divine messenger did not argue. The divine messenger said, "Offer what you hold tight." Jonah swallowed and felt pride like a stone in his throat. Jonah Reed said, "I give you my secret, and I give you my right to look clean." Pastor Miriam Cole said, "You are not what you hide." Lila Brooks said, "You are held even as you shake." Ethan Ward said, "I am here." The narrator said, "The light answered without heat." A pale fire rose from the candles and ran across the floor like water that remembers the sea. It climbed the columns without smoke and left no burn. The divine messenger said, "Do not fear the fire that heals." Doubt stepped back and hissed like a match gone out. Jonah Reed said, "I will stand in it." The white gleam touched his sleeves and held like warm breath. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "Let it pass through." Lila Brooks closed her eyes and smiled through tears. Ethan Ward looked amazed and did not pretend otherwise. The room felt like a lung that finally filled. The narrator said, "Doubt cracked where it stood." A seam of darkness split and showed nothing inside it. Doubt said, "You cannot forgive yourself." Jonah Reed said, "I forgive the man who ran, and I will make amends." The divine messenger bowed the head, not in rule, but in witness. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "Mercy plants new roots." Lila Brooks said, "You are allowed to start." Ethan Ward said, "I will help where I can." The white fire faded to a soft ring around the rail. The hush returned, not empty, but full. Jonah Reed said, "I am not what I feared I was." The candles settled to small, faithful flames. The narrator said, "The fire that did not burn left warmth behind." Jonah Reed said, "I will go and set things right." The divine messenger said, "Go in the light you carry." Pastor Miriam Cole said, "You do not walk alone." Lila Brooks said, "Call if your steps shake." Ethan Ward said, "I will drive if you need me." Doubt was only a thinning echo and had no words left. The floor did not tremble. The air felt clear, like new rain after dust. The narrator said, "What held him now was not fear, but a quiet strength that would not let him go." Morning came clear and plain, and the streets smelled like rain and dust. The narrator said, Jonah walked toward the precinct and counted each step. Ethan Ward drove beside the curb and matched his pace. Ethan Ward said, "If you falter, I stay." Jonah Reed said, "I will speak and accept what follows." The glass doors showed his face steadier than before. He felt the night of the crash rise like a wave and then pass. The narrator said, "Truth waited inside, and it did not snarl." Pastor Miriam Cole met him at the steps and lifted a hand. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "You are not alone in this house, or the next." Lila Brooks stood a little back and breathed for him. Lila Brooks said, "You can shake and go forward." Jonah Reed said, "I will tell them what I did, and what I will do to men." The sanctuary held the soft smell of wax and old wood. The narrator said Miriam stayed and faced the place where she once failed. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "I did not answer a cry, and I have carried that weight." Light from the window drew a calm line across the rail. She set a small note on the altar and read it out loud. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "I will answer now, and I will be quick to hear." The words felt simple and right. The narrator said, regret turned from a closed fist into an open palm. She bowed her head and let silence do the rest. Pastor Miriam Cole said, "Bless Jonah's road and mine." The hush warmed the room, and she breathed easier. She rose and knew the past was not erased, yet it was held. Ethan waited in the car with the engine off and the windows cracked. The narrator said, he did not trust words as much as what stayed after them. A sparrow landed on the mirror and blinked once. Ethan Ward said, "I keep saying it was luck, but I felt more than luck." He thought of the crosswalk, the red light, and the near miss. The memory still hummed in his skin like low current. The narrator said, a new room opened in him, small and lit. Ethan Ward said, "I do not know the name of it, but it feels true." He watched the precinct doors and did not fidget. Ethan Ward said, "If this is real, I will not run from it." The air smelled like rain drying on warm glass. He held his seat like a promise. Lila walked the community room and checked the chairs one by one. The narrator said, "She remembered the night she confessed and lived." Lila Brooks said, "Grace did not erase my history, but it changed its weight." She set cups by the pot and smiled at the steam. The door opened, and she hoped Jonah would stand here soon and tell others what he told them. The narrator said she saw her story rhyme with his and felt joy that did not shout. Lila Brooks said, "We keep the doors open, even when we are tired." She placed a small card that read "Welcome" on the table. The room felt like a hand ready to steady a shaky wall. The cups clinked softly like gentle bells. Jonah stepped back into his room at dusk and opened the window. The narrator said, the air felt new, like rain had washed a long road. He set the unlit candle on the floor and did not need it. Jonah Reed said, I spoke, and I will make it right." The quiet held his words like seed in soil. The divine messenger stood near the wall without shadow. The divine messenger said, "I will not leave." Jonah Reed said, "Then teach me to stay." The room warmed, though the sun was low. The narrator said, "Light did not blaze now, it rested." He closed his eyes and did not feel alone. The path ahead was long, but it was clear enough to walk.